Welcome to Stelligent's DevOps on AWS Radio, with your hosts, Paul Duvall and Brian Jakovich.
Welcome to our 22nd episode of DevOps on AWS Radio. I'm Paul Duvall, CTO at Emphasis Stelligent. You can check out our previous episodes by searching on DevOps on AWS Radio and by going to Stelligent's blog. We are hiring. We're always hiring. We're looking for engineers who are passionate about continuous integration, continuous delivery, DevOps on the AWS platform. In this episode, we're going to change it up a little bit, and we're going to be discussing some recent DevOps on AWS news. It's been a couple months since we did this, so we'll go through, at least at a high level, some of the news related to DevOps and AWS. But Brian and I are going to have a discussion because this has come up with some customers, and we figured that some enterprises out there might want to get a picture of what a enterprise transformation DevOps on AWS might look like. And the fact is that they come in various flavors and colors and sizes, so we're just going to give some general ideas of what to think about and what we've seen. So if you're at an enterprise and you want to take this on, here are some of the things that at least that we've been through and that might be helpful to you. So let's get into some DevOps on AWS news. So I'm just going to run through a few things, but there's now actually Mike Roberts over at Symphonia. He put together a multi-region code pipeline example. He has this out in GitHub. It's a great example. It goes through how to set up a deployment pipeline across multiple regions on AWS, because this is a new feature that was announced, I think it was at reInvent or right before reInvent. So definitely check that out. He's got all the source code there, so 2 thumbs up for that. So thanks a lot, Mike, for putting that together. We'll put that in the show notes. So there's a tutorial out there of creating a pipeline that uses Amazon S3 as a deployment provider now, and I believe this is a new feature as well. Before, you basically, in order to do the same, you would use code build as an action, but now you can deploy, say, a static website directly using code pipeline and S3. So we also have a link to that tutorial. This is on AWS's site. There are a couple announcements around code build. Code build now supports accessing images from a private Docker registry. Prior, of course, you could only do it through public. And also code build now supports accessing cross-account ECR images. And then, of course, before you could only do this on within your own AWS account. We're seeing a lot more of that going on in terms of both multi-region but also cross-account capabilities. So I expect to see more of those types of capabilities coming out from AWS, as in many ways accounts themselves, especially in mature organizations that have been using AWS for a while and also optimizing AWS and applying DevOps techniques, for example, to this, are going to see really even AWS accounts as transient in a way. Also want to talk about config. Config has increased its default limits for AWS config rules. And now you can, prior to this change, you could have 50 AWS config rules per account per region. Now it's 150 AWS config rules per account per region. If you remember way back, it's probably a couple years ago, Brian and I talked about basically compliance as code. And you can use config rules as it's basically, it's a managed service, and you can set up your own custom rules. You can use managed rules that are built into AWS, but you can look for things like really any rule you'll ultimately want to run, but like MFA has been enabled. You can even look at things like ingress egress groups and how your security groups have been set up. I mean, you name it, you can put it in a config rule, but it's it's a managed service. So it's great to see that you can even put more, because you can come up against those limits pretty quickly. But it's really a great way to ensure that your AWS account, your AWS accounts are always in a compliant state. And then Cloud9 now supports AWS CloudTrail logging. And then there's this, Brian, I'm not sure if you saw this, but I think it was a few weeks ago, so I think sometime in January, AWS came out on AWS Labs in their GitHub repository, a AWS Lambda container image converter. So basically, you get a container image, and you can convert it to Lambda. So it uses the new AWS Lambda layers capability to take a container image and then basically make it serverless. Had you seen that?
I hadn't, but at least from the perspective of customers that we've worked with, that's a big deal, right? It's intended so that you can kind of build your own working state, and then you can run and execute your Lambdas out of an environment you've already predefined, right?
Yeah, so people are, that's the nice thing about containers is that it looks and feels similar, right, to, let's say, traditional EC2, or at least traditional infrastructure in general. And yeah, but the serverless looks a lot different. So the idea that this is an open source utility to then, especially now that we have Lambda layers, where you have basically some of the dependencies that are defined in these layers. I haven't used it yet, so I'm definitely interested in having a look at it. But the idea, the concept is really intriguing.
Totally understand that.
Yep. So AWS Config, again, coming up in the news, adds support for AWS Service Catalog. What that would mean is, any of the changes that you're going to make in Service Catalog will be able to get picked up in AWS Config. That's another one where I expect to see kind of more and more capabilities being added, and it's great for compliance and being able to see what changed, especially over a period of time in your AWS accounts. And the last thing I want to talk about is using AWS Code Deploy. This is a blog post on the DevOps blog on AWS, but you can use AWS Code Deploy to implement blue-green deployments for AWS Fargate and Amazon ECS. So that capability was announced at AWS reInvent 2018. And so they have a nice little walkthrough of how you might do that. All right, so let's get into the main topic. The main topic is going to be really Brian and me talking about what we've seen with our enterprise customers, and also having done this for a decade on AWS. People that we've come across, and enterprise we've come across, whether we actually work with them or not. And so we're going to have an accompanying blog post on this. But I thought what we would do is just talk through some of the high-level components of what you might consider when it comes to a DevOps on AWS transformation. And what we found is that these transformations can come in many different forms, but sort of at a high level, what we tend to see is that there are two main ways that this usually occurs. One is we'll see it start as a grassroots kind of movement or bottom up. And then sometimes we see a top-down strategy. From what our experience is, in both of these cases, if it's bottom-up or top-down, these transformations ultimately have to meet in the middle. At some point, you can't have a truly top-down strategy, at least effective transformation. And then also when it starts up as a grassroots movement, in order to really get some scale and really transform the organization, executives and others really need to get involved and help enable that transformation. So yeah, in the blog post we go over a bit more detail. But Brian, if you want to talk, maybe get things started by talking at a very high level of, let's just say we're looking at a period of a 3-year transformation. And we've seen transformations happen, I mean, depending on the enterprise, and we're talking about multi-billion-dollar enterprise usually. Those are the types of customers that we work with. But 3 years might be on average. It sort of depends on the organization. Some have fits and starts in terms of how they go through the transformation. But kind of generically, if we talk about the key components, the steps that they might go through in their transformation, let's start things off by talking about that.
Yeah, so it's one of the most complex discussion topics, but I think we can take it from a couple of different scenarios. So an organization, let's say from a top-down approach, typically they'll look at it from multi-level, multi-layer type of activities. I'd say they typically start with like an assessment, a portfolio assessment, reviewing, if they're an enterprise, they're going to have applications that are from every end of the spectrum when it comes to built recently and they've been using the modern practices, to things that are probably in mainframe systems that are likely on-prem, running out of their data centers and such, but everything in between, right? So typically where they start is doing an assessment to kind of categorize all these different applications and where they fit and what their different characteristics are, and really kind of looking at from a complexity standpoint as from both business value but also to complexity of changing and what that means to the business. So they'll take a look at that and start to put together an idea of end-to-end where each application fits on that spectrum and what it would take to do anything with that.
And what are they usually trying to achieve? Not just in that, but what are they usually trying to achieve in the transformation itself? Like what are the real benefits that they're seeking?
Usually, I'd say it really is looking for top-line revenue. And when I say that, it's maybe not specifically focused on let's meet a particular dollar number, but it's being able to deliver faster and a lot of different variations with that. So it's focused on being able to adapt to market trends and whatnot is what at least we've been seeing recently around the initiatives that a lot of these big enterprises are going down. So the focus of the transformation is, right now, it's really difficult to release. It's really difficult to make changes to these applications. How can we increase those feedback cycles so that we're closer to our customers, and so that when a customer has a new feature that they need, or a group of customers come back and say, hey, we need this particular feature, the business can adapt to that. So that's really the end goal that they're looking for.
So it's both it's a combination of a brittle software delivery process doesn't have that speed that you're talking about, but it's also probably brittle architectures associated with that are causing the software delivery process to be slow.
Exactly. You have applications that were built 20 years ago that the modern practices that hopefully over the time we've gotten better as an industry. I think we have, and they're looking at re-architecting these things to effectively use some of the modern practices. And it takes a lot to be able to take something that one doesn't have a lot of, let's say, developers. If it's written in COBOL, you have a smaller group of people that are actively building upon that are ingrained in that language. And then it's also the modern practices are built for newer things, the Ruby on Rails, the Python development, Node.js, you name it.
Okay, so let's get back to it. You were talking about the portfolio assessment. So you're going to be going over the sort of the high level things first, and then we'll get into the detail of each of those things as we talk about this.
Right. Yeah. So when your enterprises are doing an assessment, they're typically looking at a couple of different factors, right? They're looking at the size of the application, the user base, stuff like that. The let's say the scale of the application, how many ultimately CPU, RAM, those types of requirements. That's more specific things. The application when it comes to the architecture, the language it's used, what are the different components and the tiered architecture. All these sorts of things, they start to cut them up and determine, where they fit on the spectrum. So, for instance, on the left end and more legacy things, you probably have like a COBOL application or a PL1 application that is going to be on the more difficult side to move or to be able to transform. Versus you have applications that are written in Node.js that are already built into Lambda functions that probably don't need much. So it's kind of categorizing everything in between around the characteristics around the application.
Okay, so let's get into those details a bit later in terms of all the steps that you might go through in an assessment and the portfolio as well. So they've had this assessment. They're looking at their entire portfolio. What might happen after that?
Yeah, so once they've done the assessment, right, they've figured out all the different types of variations of an application, they are then typically going to look and start to pick out some easy wins. It's not necessarily easy wins, but things they're doable, but will also show business value. So you would look at something that may be written in, for example's sake, written in Java that's deployed onto Tomcat, but generally provides some level of value to the organization. The purpose of this is to pick out a group of these applications and then to build what we'll get into in a second, I would assume, is to talk about building a platform around that to actually enable these particular applications to start to structure something that's going to fix them so that you can get to your end state of being able to deliver these things faster. To pick a couple pilot applications, as we like to call them, as the first ones to run through that we're going to focus on building a platform to support them, not really to support every single use case in the world.
Okay, so when you say pilot, it's actually you're going to production. But you're choosing a few small product teams that you're going to take to production and kind of learn from.
Exactly. You want to show success to the business quickly, right? You want to be able to, so there's going to be some level of investment to go and do this, but you want to show the business stakeholders that when you're investing in building these types of platforms and whatnot, let's say continuous delivery pipelines and the infrastructure to support compliance and security and whatnot, all these things that you're putting together, you want to be able to show at the end of whatever your phase approach is going to look like, that you got somewhere, that you are able to deliver these particular applications to production quicker. And that point is when you can get buy-in, and more stakeholders are interested in being part of that of the program.
Okay, so you have a platform, and these platform consist of a collection of services, and these services are built by basically internal product teams, and their customers are really other developers or other engineers within the enterprise.
Yeah, so the platform is a pretty special concept, but a lot of the times, in the past couple of years, people have been focusing on, infrastructure as code and all these things. And what we've seen is that while the concept is great, it's kind of siloed these type of activities to, you're the infrastructure as code guy, you are the person that's focused on Docker containers or something. So what we typically suggest to embrace is that you're building out these capabilities, these platform capabilities and services. So let's say you have a pipeline factory, something that is developed by a team, and we look at them as kind of software development teams, just like someone would be building a product that is user-facing, that is, if you're like a banking application, a mobile banking application or something like that, you would also have a software development team that is focused on building that pipeline factory and that had all the capabilities that mobile banking application team needed. So you are developing that, let's say a pipeline factory, you have a compliance factory, things that are all part of a platform that enable these development teams, these application teams, to self-service request this functionality and consume it the same way as they would consume, an application.
Mm-hmm. And everything is basically available through API and/or self-service means.
Right. What we want to get away from is building out these siloed approaches that, you are creating this special way of automating your infrastructure and using, let's say, Chef or Ansible, Puppet scripts and whatnot, but being the infrastructure as code person, that's their purpose. Instead, what we'd like to suggest is that you are taking these capabilities and you're building them as self-service mechanisms that can be requested through, self-service means.
And so we've had on a couple of other podcast episodes, we've seen kind of different approaches to this, where they have a platform suite of services. And in some cases, we've seen some of our customers will either allow the individual, product teams, developer teams that are creating these end user services they can choose to use the platform. In other cases, we've seen where there's sort of a edict in the organization that you need to use the platform. It is interesting. I remember when we were talking with Netflix about this, I think even though there was no edict that said they had to use that platform suite of services, I think he was saying there was 90 to 95% are actually using those platforms, because it sounds like their end customers as well. They just happen to be internal customers, so they're listening to their customers. But anyway, it's just interesting. There's different approaches to the same thing. That's what we're seeing though. Generally, is they're creating this platform suite of services. They're available, and as you talked about, they're not doing it in an ivory tower. They're actually working with an initial set of teams, and then as the teams grow, they would continue to listen to the customer feedback and incorporate those changes into the delivery platform of service suite of services.
Yeah, I'd say that what we've seen the more successful group is that the magnetic approach is kind of how I think about it, where you're building something so incredible, something that has so many features and reduces the complexity. If I were an application developer, right, you're removing all this complexity that I have to deal with if I have to roll my own, pipeline and security and compliance checks and whatnot, right? I prefer, as a developer, just to be able to consume something that another team has built. So it's providing such a great service that it almost makes have them no reason not to use it. Yeah. Is typically what we've seen.
I like that. I haven't heard that, the magnetic approach. That's a good way of thinking of it. But, it depends on the organization. It works. I tend to think the magnetic approach is ideal, but sometimes people need to work through their baby steps, as they go through that transformation, because some of it is really just getting buy-in from the teams.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So the third kind of high level step, or it's not so much a phase, because we're all, you're continually going through all this, because I would imagine that you might do an initial assessment discovery, but you're also continually looking at what's changed, new applications, things like that. But in any case, so the third part is the onboarding. It sounds like you were talking about.
Yeah, so you can build all these components, right? You can build a great pipeline factory, you can build a great compliance factory, a great account factory, but across an enterprise that has thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even past that of our developers, some level of separation of actual teams. You need to be able to onboard these people, and we think of them more, I guess, enablement, right? That you have a team that is focused on taking both their understanding of an application team, application architecture and whatnot, but also an understanding of where the platform capabilities are and what has been created and what's available for these teams, and then going and embedding on these teams and getting them towards using these services. So it's the act of enabling the organization to start to leverage this stuff. It's a little bit of evangelism, I'd say, to start to pump these things up and also to understand the application team. So one thing to not forget is that this platform that we're talking about is an ongoing development effort, the same way as an application is. So where there are going to be inevitable gaps from let's say the first iteration or all the way to the 10th iteration or the 20th of the platform, you want to be using your business users, and for a platform team, it would be the actual application teams, to understand their requirements, their needs, and to actually get those types of things back on the backlog. So the enablement team both is an onboarding team, but also kind of for the application teams to get the features they need into the platform.
Okay, so they're in constant communication with the platform teams as well as they're going through this, and of course the individual application teams. So you were saying before that this is in many ways a self-service capability in terms of what the platform might typically provide to its product teams, these external facing product teams. And so with this enablement, this doesn't sound like self-service. So this is more of a white glove kind of work with them to onboard them to the delivery platform.
Yeah, so it's going to take some time to, like, for instance, AWS offers a million different services as self-service, but you really need to understand what these things are capable of. Mm-hmm. The same way as, like, if you're building a platform, it's very going to be an intricate platform designed very specifically for the organization, the enterprise. So it's getting these teams ready and then also understanding their needs. So, for instance, we typically suggest the enablement team embeds with the application team for something between 1 and 3 months to go and understand where they are right now, understand their architecture, and then ultimately start to move them towards the platform services that make sense for them. Maybe that's not everything, but the areas in which that would make sense, that would add business value to these application teams, but also then to get features back into the backlog of the platform team so that they can be iterating and ultimately enable these teams in the future.
And also, as we know, I mean, it's not just about the platform itself, it's also the practices that the individual engineers need to embrace in order to get the most out of the platform. So you start thinking about, continuous integration, continuous delivery. Are they running their tests with, every single change? How often are they committing their code? Are they committing their code at least once a day, and they're committing their code to the main line at least once a day? And when a test or whatever fails, are they fixing the problem that occurs within the first 10 minutes? Basically, I'm going through the certification test that Jez Humble and Martin Fowler so much about, right? Those types of practices and, stopping the line, which is, basically the 10-minute rule and how to write tests. And there's a lot of change, right? And so even though you can self-service those platform services in the context of what we're talking about here, there's also the individual development practices that they really need to make a part of their sort of everyday behavior.
Yeah, exactly. For instance, if you think about it, typically with a platform, let's say a pipeline factory, what we often see organizations building are they'll provide the general structure of a pipeline, and then more or less the areas where you need to fill in the gaps, right, that are relevant to your application. So you don't want to be building these things that are specific to the factory only is ready for a Java application. At some point, it should be able to support a variety of different applications where they fill in, say, if I'm a Ruby application, I go and put in my RSpec test in order to execute my RSpec test suite, or inside the build stage, or execute stack analysis checks. All these things you want to be incorporating, but for application teams that are going through this, they need to be upskilled in the sense where they need to start to understand some of the continuous integration, continuous delivery practices that the enablement team is intended to impart on them. So It's definitely more than just the onboarding, it's also upskilling as well.
Right. And how about re-architecture? Do you typically see enterprises incorporating that as a part of the enablement, or is that a separate activity that might occur?
Yeah, very much so. That's going to be more the 1 month activities. So, for instance, if you were to do if you think about the embedding model, if it's a 1 month type of thing, you're typically thinking that they have probably more modern architecture. They're ready to effectively use the platform. But if you
it's a new application altogether or something.
Yeah, exactly. But if you have a older application, more legacy type of thing, you might either be thinking about re-architecting the thing altogether. You could be thinking about how do you start to perform the strangler method and start to slice up the monolith type of application over time. Those things become more complex. But yes, the enablement team is intending to bring those